Welcome to The Perspectivalist. Our agenda is to offer a perspective of the world that allows you to think more clearly as a Christian. We want the normativity of scriptures to be the starting point of everything we do. So thanks for joining the conversation. This is Season 5, Episode 3, and I am your host, Yuri Brito. I'm here joined by an acquaintance of mine that we first met in Miami, Florida for the NatCon 3, I believe, Mr. Renn, who is a writer, consultant in various places, specifically a senior fellow at the American Reformer. And one of his great aims in our day is to help conservatives in the American church rise to the challenge of finding success in the 21st century. He's been published in a variety of places. I encourage you to subscribe to Aaron Rand's Substack, which is just filled with sociological and even theological gems for those who are contemplating how to engage the world in which we live now. And his newest book is entitled Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. Aaron, welcome to The Perspectivalist.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. I've been very delighted to read your work throughout the years, your work on masculinity, your work on the sociology of the church. As someone who's very intrigued by pastoral theology, who wrote a dissertation of pastoral theology, I found a lot of your work, specifically in this latest book, to be very pertinent to the pastoral pressures and the ecclesiastical pressures that we face today. Just for our listeners who are maybe getting acquainted with you for the first time, would you mind offering, Aaron, a little bit of a definition of the three worlds that you discuss in the book, and then we'll work a little bit through that afterwards.
Absolutely. So America never had a state church like in Europe, but for most of our history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default state religion. So if you go back to, say, the 1950s, about half of all adults attended church every Sunday. That was the high watermark of church attendance in the country. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. I guess it was a very sort of, faith-friendly society, still very, again, generic Protestant-oriented, although by the 50s, it was sort of becoming a little more, you might say, Judeo-Christian, as Catholics and Jews were sort of being included into that. But nevertheless, Christianity was held in honor publicly. Then in the 1960s, this Protestant consensus began to unravel, and the status of Christianity went into decline in America, a decline that continues to this day. And I divide that period of decline from, say, 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. This is a period of decline. I want to be clear on that. All's not going well. Church attendance is down, right? That sort of stuff is happening. But at the same time, society basically viewed Christianity positively. To be known as a good church-going man made you seem like an upstanding member of society. And Christian moral norms were the basic moral norms of society. 1994, we hit a tipping point and enter what I call the neutral world, where Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a pluralistic public square, and Christian moral norms have a sort of residual effect. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, Christianity is now viewed negatively by elite, sort of secular culture, the official culture of the country. And again, all throughout American history, there were many dubious believers, even going back to the founding fathers, right? They weren't exactly all Christians, so to speak, but Christianity was publicly held in honor. What's different now is people don't feel the need to pretend that anymore. Christian morality is now expressly repudiated, and in fact, often now viewed as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And I think a lot of the hand-wringing about Christian nationalism, I think, is a good example of this kind of new view of Christianity as a threat, maybe in the way that, Islamic terrorism was considered a threat in the post 9/11 era, which in retrospect, I think, greatly overstated. But probably a topic for a different podcast. But I think the shift into the negative world has been very dislocating for evangelicals, and they're struggling to figure out what to do.
Aaron, let's situate the COVID world that took place from 2020 to approximately 2023, was the COVID world and everything that took place politically and sociologically, was that an additional confirmation of the negative world, or did you see elements of hope in there?
Well, I would say there's COVID era pandemic mostly did not have to do with this in my view. However, I do think you could see a little bit of glimmers of negativities towards Christians in there. For example, you go to California, medical marijuana dispensaries, medical, of course. Marijuana dispensaries are open, liquor stores are open. In some cases, I think strip clubs are even open. Churches are closed, according to state order. And of course, John MacArthur famously, defied them, took them to court, and was completely vindicated. In fact, LA County paid his attorney fees, which tells you like what a disaster that case was for them. So there was some of that, definitely the idea of labeling churches as non-essential entities that could be shut down while the bars are open and everything else, I think tells you something about the negativity. But I do think the rest of it's mostly indirect. And here's one thing I would say: churches and many other institutions were sort of ripped apart by the COVID response. So some churches, were like, we have to shut down. Others were, we have to stay open. There was tremendous dissension over COVID. And if as a minister, maybe you didn't hear, but almost every pastor is hearing it from all directions. It was a terrible time to be a pastor, listening to congregants like pressure you on all sides. And then, of course, the George Floyd killing, and then the riots coming after that, and the BLM movement there. But I think, again, these sort of were reinforcing pre-existing trends that were already there. The left-wing pundit Matthew Iglesias talked about the Great Awakening on race as starting in 2014. So, the BLM movement in 2020 was simply an extension of something that was already there. Similarly, I think many of the intra-evangelical or intra-church debates were essentially in COVID, were basically just accentuating divisions that were already there as a result of two previous factors. One is Donald Trump and people's opinions of Donald Trump, and the other one is wokeness and kind of the woke turn in the church. And so those two things really were like polarize people like a magnet, so to speak. And I think the COVID was sort of an overlay on that. It wasn't a new way to divide people, right? If you were militant about keeping your church closed, you're probably anti-Trump, and you're probably like pro BLM kind of thing, and vice versa.
So walk me through the pastoral efforts in these three different eras. How did pastors function in the positive world, neutral world, and in the negative world? Obviously, there are different strategies there, but walk me through a little bit, maybe perhaps a sample, and how pastoral labors function in these three eras.
Sure. So, I guess there were basically three main evangelical responses to this period of decline. There were sort of two kind of strategies that emerged in the positive world and one in the neutral world. And so, in the positive world, that was culture war and seeker sensitivity. And in the neutral world, that was cultural engagement. So the culture war is the religious right as we know it. People like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, they saw that, things were not going their way in the culture, and they decided to mobilize politically to fight back. We're going to take back the country. The very name of the leading organization of that era, Moral Majority, speaks to a world in which it was at least plausible to claim something like that. Now, it may not have been true even then, but it was at least plausible to claim. The other one was seeker sensitivity, started by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, and then Rick Warren at Saddleback Church in Orange County. This also got going in the 70s and 80s, just like culture war. And these guys saw that people weren't attending church. And they also saw that there was a big kind of emerging baby boomer suburbia of people that needed to be reached. And they said, well, why don't we create a church people actually attend? So the origin story of Willow Creek is that Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago asking people why they didn't go to church. And he said, I got an earful. And so they designed churches people would attend. This was sort of the start of what we think of today as the non-denominational suburban megachurch. which is basically in many ways the evangelical mainstream. So they say, we're getting rid of things like clerical collars and robes and, stodgy old hymns and organ music. We're going to get rid of all that. It's going to be informal, contemporary music, topical therapeutic sermons, that sort of thing. And it was very successful there. Then in the neutral world, we saw the emergence of a third strategy called cultural engagement, pioneered by people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. And I think there are a couple of ways to think about cultural engagement. One is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. Rudy Giuliani became mayor in New York. Crime collapsed. There'd already sort of been a nascent urban renaissance, but this really turbocharged it. All these people were moving into the cities, and this is trying to speak to that demographic. Another way to think about it is as the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, why don't we have a conversation? Why don't we sit down and take advantage of this pluralistic public square to have just a different conversation about things? And again, you can think of that as the urban church movement, the college town church movement. And all of these are still with us today. And that doesn't account for everybody. Like, for example, the neo-Anabaptists don't really fit into this schema. And maybe a lot of churches don't fit cleanly into them. But I think these do represent certain emphases that we can all recognize in the evangelical church.
So one of the concerns I assume people have had with the taxonomy you sort of use is that these categories, they don't fit neatly, which you affirm throughout the book, and that's a fairly reasonable sort of assertion. These are just ways of grabbing hold of societal trends and trajectories. One of them, of course, you note this in page 114 when you talk about the nature of the evangelical church as, in some ways, that we aren't a majority anymore, right? And therefore, we need to create subcultures or countercultures that are able to sort of adjust to the antithetical nature of the world towards Christianity. What role do you see in this countercultural production and project in churches forming communities to adapt to this new world in which they live?
Yeah, that's a complex question. But I think if we go back to the 1950s, if sort of Christianity is the default religion of the country, and people are by and large expected to be Christian or go along with the Christian system or show up to church, when you have half of all adults attending church every Sunday, then you sort of have to have a seat for everybody who wants one. You can't be too demanding on people. I think about Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. He talks about the dilemma of renunciation. This idea is if you want to have a broad, you can either have super Christians, you can either tolerate super Christians like monks, two-speed Christianity, where you've got super Christians and everybody else. Or if you want to have this very broad Christianity, then it has to be like a low bar. You have to let anybody kind of cross it. And that's sort of what we had. We had very low bar Christianity in America for a long time. And, you could view seeker sensitivity as another form of low bar Christianity. I don't think it's entirely, I'm not entirely negative towards that. I think there's a lot of good to be said about not putting artificial barriers between people and the gospel. But at the same time, it wasn't super demanding of the people who went there. And I think one of the things that being in this negative world where you're a minority, one, you of necessity have to think like a minority. And so look at all the other minorities in, American history and how they've had to, sustain their own communities. Now, I don't think all of those are great examples for us. Obviously, racial minorities don't fit well with a non-racialized religion like Christianity. Niche religions don't count as much. But you could think about something like pre-war Catholicism and what they had to do to sustain, Catholic life in basically a Protestant country that didn't like Catholics all that much. So now we have to think that way. We have to create institutions and practices that demarcate and sustain community life, and it help us to transmit our faith to coming generations. And so that's an imperative. And secondly, the fact that we don't have we aren't just like everybody's supposed to be in church on Sunday. It is really more of a choice. A decided lifestyle choice, if you want to call it that in kind of secular terms, that we can afford to have a thicker community and much more expectations about what it means to be a Christian. I mean, if you look in the New Testament, there's a pretty high bar. that Paul sets about what it means to be the church. And I'm not a theologian or a pastor, I always say that. I'm kind of very inspired by the New Testament, which if you look at the New Testament, it's a small church in the Roman Empire. They're not that concerned about what the Roman Empire is doing. They're concerned about what the church is doing. And so this may not be a super popular take, but I think, in this era, we need to be less concerned about, fighting with what the world is doing. They're going to be doing what they're doing. We're not going to be rolling back gambling legalization or anything like that. There's no point in that. The question is, how are we going to live? And I think that ought to be much more of a focus. And the truth is, a model that I mentioned and I think has been very effective, again, I'm not exactly saying we should do this, but it's like the Mormons. If you look at the Mormons, one, they're an extremely high functioning community, very successful, getting married, having lots of kids. I mean, again, they're not perfect, but they're cut above, America as a whole. They tend to laugh it off when people make fun of Mormons. People, they create a play on Broadway, the Book of Mormon. Like, they don't get too indignant when people make fun of Mormons. Mitt Romney, when they were attacking him for magic underwear when he was running for president, he didn't get all, angry about that. Third, most people don't even know what Mormonism believes, right? I mean, the average person couldn't tell you anything about their theology. But fourth, they're growing like gangbusters, right? They're making tons of converts. So they're making converts, we're shrinking. So I look at that and I say, wow, they're doing something right there that we maybe could learn from. And again, we can't just plop the Mormon system down here for a whole host of reasons. But nevertheless, that model of like a healthy, attractive community that's growing by adding converts, but isn't necessarily fighting with people all the time. I think that's the sort of thing we ought to be aiming at.
You, as a follow-up, you talk about this in page 203 about evangelical need to have high-level skills and competency in
Yeah.
many fields. Do you view this as one reason that evangelicals have obviously, there's a history of reactionary treatment to any sort of worldly accusations? And you're not arguing against Christians reacting, but one way to react would be to sort of build high level skills and competence so that the Christian world is able to present an offering of themselves that is not subpar, but that actually elevates the conversation within Christendom before the world. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah. Well, again, I look at the New Testament. If you look at Paul, if you look at 1 Peter 2, it basically says, live in a way so that, the pagans see your way of life and, they don't have anything to critique. You know what I mean? They can look at your good deeds, let people see your good deeds that you're doing so they can glorify God. Let them see, your pattern of life. And if you read, I include a clip in my book from this famous letter from Julian the Apostate, where he's complaining. He's trying to get the Romans religion back. He's like, the problem is we're not taking care of the poor. The Christians are taking care of the poor. Look at how they love each other. Look at how they have good funerals. Look at how they have they're living in such more moral lives that everybody can see how much better they're living. We need to be in the game here. And I think there is a sense in which, the early Christian church, there was something attractive about their way of life. And there's something very attractive about the Mormon way of life, I think, as well. Almost every mommy influencer online is a Mormon, as near as I can tell. And there was actually a great essay. It may have been in Salon, if you remember Salon magazine. It's like, I am like a hardcore atheist feminist, but why am I so obsessed with Mormon mommy blogs? And there is something about, about that. And, they've, again, not to keep tooting their horn here, I'm not going to become a Mormon, believe me. But, they actually select their leadership for competence. If you look at the people who are running, Mormon churches, Mormon enterprises, they're heavy hitters, like Mitt Romney. Like, okay, Mitt Romney's like running the Utah Olympics. He's a managing partner in Bain Capital, and he's also a bishop, which of course their ministry, they don't like have their ministers are very different than ours. They're not preaching sermons, right, and stuff like that. But you look at the people who are on the quorum of the 12 or whatever they call it, they're like the top people. They're all like, here's a world-class surgeon. Here's a former member of the Utah Supreme Court. I mean, they actively look at the people who are high functioning people and like say, you're the one that is going to be like the new bishop, whether you want to be or not. Whereas I think, one of the things I've noticed about contemporary Christianity, everybody self-selects, self-discerns into ministry. The people who go into ministry are the people who decided that for whatever reason they wanted to go into it. I think one thing we could do is we could be much more aggressive about seeing a young person who's like, wow, this person is really, I see that they've got all the, requirements from, First Timothy and Titus. They can teach, they're like, this is a person that we should actively encourage to go into the ministry. You don't really hear that. I don't hear too much about that. So I think like, we could talk about confidence, but like, we don't, that's not even a factor in like ministry selection. Now, maybe it is when people are trying to hire a pastor or whatever, but like our pipeline competence in like a lot of things is really not even like there. It's just total self-selection into it. And so that's maybe one of my more provocative takes. But I think, we need to be very concerned about like skill level and competence in a lot of things. And again, that's not a substitute for the more foundational issues of like leading your family well, like, being above reproach, all that stuff is foundational. But given that you have the foundations, there's things above that, and, and I think it's interesting. Jesus picked his disciples. His disciples didn't pick him. He didn't select from the people who decided they want to go into the, rabbinic seminary kind of thing. And so let me get that. He's like, no, these are the people I'm picking. And you're coming after me and I'm doing it. And that's like a different, there's almost sort of like, Paul picking Timothy. I'm taking this guy because I see this young
Right.
guy's got what I want. I think there's some of that we need to think about how to operationalize some of that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating interest, especially for somebody in my position right now, because there is John Murray talks about the internal and the external call, but the evangelical world has functioned in this sort of self-appointed priesthood, and they forget that there is an externalized affirmation of who they are and what their calling and benefits might be for the community. So I've argued against the pietization of pastoral calling in our day, and I think you confirm a lot of my suspicions in that area there.
There's also a huge shortage. Apparently, there's a huge shortage of younger generation pastors. A lot of seminaries are like collapsing, and even if evangelicalism shrinks a lot, we're going to need to like fill up our pipeline. So we're going to have to be proactive about filling up our pipeline and get creative on that, and thinking about the kinds of people. And I was talking about this in the book. Like, it's going to be being a pastor's always been a tough job. It's going to get even tougher now. Think about the people who are, we're dealing with all this stuff during COVID. High conflict, high dissension environment is going to be the norm. You got to have the mental toughness, like Paul. Like if you read Paul, it's not just in 2 Corinthians. He's not just talking about the physical trials he suffers. He's talking about the mental strain of all the churches I'm responsible for, all the sins I'm dealing with in other people. This is like it's a psychological and emotional burden on people. And like having that resiliency and mental toughness is going to be really important as a pastoral qualification going forward. There's so many things we're going to have to think about because like it is like, a very, very tough profession to go into, especially today.
Yeah, and you do mention this in the Pastoral Pressures in the Negative World. There was a Substack by Father Calvin Robinson yesterday about the decrease of candidacy in the Church of England. They've decreased by 40%, I think. There are 40% less candidates going to the Church of England. That is a real matter, and there is certainly an agitation going on in these ecclesiastical courts about what are we going to do for the next. Now, do you see, because this is also happening, of course, in conservative bodies like the PCA, for example, and the larger evangelical corpus that you mentioned, examples of this in Bethlehem and, in Bethlehem Baptist and other sort of environments where there is not just a conversation of quitting, but people are voluntarily quitting their positions. And so that's a unique, they're not handling in some way the kinds of ecclesiastical structures that the church maybe 50 years ago weren't so much putting on their plates, but now they're dealing with not just a plate full of issues, but the plate is full and somebody's saying, here's another plate of issues. COVID may have exacerbated that, but the natural pressures and tensions exist. Is that more common in your estimation? Is that, in other words, a a Protestant failure of nerve in certain situations that the pastoral motif has allowed itself to enter into a world of conflict? Is that a lack of leadership?
I mean, I don't think there's any avoiding conflict. I mean, we just need to internalize that conflict is going to be a reality.
Uh-huh.
And that doesn't mean that we seek out conflict. And this is it. I'm a very conflict averse person, just historically. And, I think that's something we just have to get more comfortable with conflict, more comfortable with the difficult situations. I was blown away at the church I was attending during COVID. The pastor there had been a pastor for over 40 years. He was basically about to retire and decided to stay on to get the church through COVID, like successfully. So he did that before he retired. He was retirement age, and he made a comment in a sermon one time, and I was not the only one who picked up on it. And this was like COVID was sort of coming to an end. He's like, the last 2 years have been the most difficult 2 years of my ministry. And I'm like, wow. And as far as I can see, this is a guy at the height of his powers. I mean, this guy was really good. He did not just one, but three different church turnarounds. So you know how difficult it is when churches run into problems turnaround. This is actually the guy who led Mike Pence to Christ in college. Okay, this guy is he is an A player. And he's talking about how difficult it was for him the last 2 years. And that goes to show you like what it was like, for some of these people. And so that's what I always say, you should try to encourage your pastor as much as you can. I always look for ways to say something nice because I know they're constantly hearing it from people who don't like what they're doing. You know, can you let them know when you do like something they're doing? That's one, and like not be a problem. Not cause them problems. And that's one reason. Like I don't talk about where I go to church. You rarely ever hear me talk about my churches or anything like that, except in the vaguest terms, because I don't want to cause any problems for these people. I want to be somebody they're glad is sitting there, right? And I'm not, you might think it's like I'm like the worst possible guy who could show up at your church because I'm going to be sending you like a detailed commentary after every sermon about what you think about this, and I could be doing that, but I typically don't. I try to be encouraging.
Well, as a pastor, I express my gratitude to you, Aaron Renn. Thank you for your labors, Aaron. I do a lot of pastoral training, different ministers, younger ministers. I'm now in my 16th year of pastoring the same congregation, and I'm training a lot of new, younger ministers coming through. They maybe have read the book and are perhaps somewhat frightened by the prospect of having longevity of ministry. What are some, maybe one or two sort of practical, sociological or even theological thoughts you would offer younger guys coming to pastoral ministry as a way of be able to endure the road ahead in the negative world?
Um, one of the things that I'm told, again, you would be the expert on this, is that it was common for people who wanted to become rabbis at the time of Jesus to sort of have a trade, like a backup trade that they knew. So Paul was a tent maker, Jesus was a carpenter. And so they didn't just become, they were rabbis, but they had apprenticed in a trade, even if they didn't practice it. And I do think that's one of the things that's worth thinking about. Do I want to become a pastor? To maybe, maybe like Jesus, you shouldn't think about going into the ministry until you're after 30 or something, where you have acquired legitimate professional skills in the world. You've gotten some experience of life there, and then you actually have a trade that if something goes wrong in your ministry, you're not left high and dry. And I think way more people now are looking at bivocational, even as another way to do that, is to like if you're being really pressured to violate your conscience by a congregation, like if the congregation wants to compromise on an issue and you've got a wife and 4 kids and you're not making any money and you're in real trouble if you get fired, that's not a good place to be. And so I think about things like how to financially structure your life with, like, I have a skill, I have a marketplace skill, maybe I even keep a toe in the marketplace. um those sorts of things, like, really help you. And CR Wiley has talked about that, where he was kind of a blue collar guy. He's like a really interesting guy because he's like a blue collar guy and he went to Harvard Divinity School. He's got both. Right? He's like elite and he's like a regular guy. And he owned some rental properties. He's like, I can maintain them, I can manage them, and like that really held him in good stead when he ran into a situation like that. He's like, actually, I have some income here. If I lose my pastorate, and so I feel like things like that, they give you um they give you like backing, so that you've got something behind you that encourages you to take, that makes it easier to take stronger stands and doesn't require you to be really on the verge of bankruptcy or something if something goes wrong there, because it could. That's reality. So I think things like that are things to consider. Not that everyone has to do that. I'm not saying that's a model for everyone or that the Bible says you must do this by any means. But I think it might be wise to think about something like that.
Aaron Renn is the author of the newly published book by Zondervan called Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. I encourage pastors, of course, but parishioners alike to get a hold of this book and just grab a hold of this taxonomy, these categories as a way of thinking carefully through the last 100 years of American history. I highly recommend it. Aaron, thanks for joining us in The Perspectivalist.
Thank you for having me.